All right, hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to episode 51 of the Massive Breakdown Podcast. We have a great episode for you, as always. And speaking of new, beautiful stuff to see, we did get a look at the Sentinel Titan and the Voidwalker Warlock. They were very, very good about not showing us too much. We did not get to see the perks specifically. We only got to see one instance of each super, and the supers... The Voidwalker super in particular looked exceptionally different than what we're used to. I guess we've all kind of already, got in our mind that the Sentinel is Captain America, and it definitely appeared to be a purple Captain America, which is pretty cool. But really, until we actually get into the beta and we get some playtime for ourselves, we see what the perks are like, we're going to kind of hold off, like we mentioned earlier, on discussing those two new subclasses. We did get a possible glance at a new Void Grenade for the Warlock. But besides that, they were very careful not to show us anything that we could be too excited about at this point in time. For a little bit, it looked like Titan Scanning may have made a small comeback, but they pointed out that footage is actually very old. Yeah. And it's from a build that was even older than the Destiny Reveal event build, so there still is no Titan Scanning. There is no Warlock Surfing, unfortunately. Yep. We're not even sure. I assume Blink is still going to be in there because Blink was in there in that build. But we don't know how it's going to be. So it kind of was a double-edged sword. We got to see a little bit of the gameplay, but now we're not even sure if some of the stuff that was in the gameplay is going to be in the gameplay we get to experience for ourselves. And because of all that, it's just another, stick in the fire of let's hold off and wait and talk about it when the beta comes out as opposed to getting into it now.
Exactly.
Now, all that being said, we do have an excellent episode for you. If you notice, over the last couple of months, we started, several months ago with our Get Good series. And, about once a month or twice a month, we've done an episode where the focus is on improving yourself, improving a part of your gameplay. We had things to do before you got into a game, things to do when you first get into a game, things not to do in a game, map knowledge. We did one where we talked about how to play Rift, which was something that a lot of people seem to have hated before that, and we kind of explained to them, Rift is actually a pretty fun game type. Here you go. Granted, that's maybe my perspective because it's my favorite game type, but we'll not go down that path. Regardless, this is basically the conclusion to all of those things. So if you were to take all 5 of those episodes, listen to them concurrently, or consecutively, sorry, not at the exact same time. That'd be pretty hard to listen to 5 episodes at the exact same time. If you were to listen to 5 episodes consecutively, and jot down, all the notes you need from them and start playing that way, I guarantee you would see a jump in your overall skill. And the last step is what I like to refer to as flow. It's what happens when you put it all together. Now, my definition of flow is pretty close to, I think, the actual psychological definition of flow. And it's basically when you've done something so much that you no longer have to consciously think about doing it. You just simply do it. It becomes automatic. Lime Punch Keen Koala on Crucible Playbook, when I asked him what he thought about it, said that he thought it was like a mastery of something. It was the exact same thing where you no longer have to make a conscious effort to do something because you've done it so often, you know exactly how it's going to work. You just do it. It happens. You Shia LaBeouf that shit. And flow is an amazing, amazing thing. You've all had those games, or at least I hope you have, where everything seems to go right. You're always looking at the correct spot when a guy walks around a corner. You're always the one surprising someone else. You're hitting all your shots. Your map positioning is great. Everything just seems to go right. And then conversely, you've had those games where nothing seems to go right. You can't hit your shots. It feels like you're constantly getting jumped by someone else. You're all over the place. It's awful, right? One of those is flow. The other one of those is when you're off flow, basically. And the difference between good players and bad players is good players are on flow more often than they're not, and bad players are not. And the best example of flow that I can use for you guys to visualize it was what Luminosity did over that. Basically, it was like a 10-kill spree at the Guardian Con tournament. I believe it was versus God Squad that he was playing against? It was on Rusted Lands, I know that for sure, and it was in the A flag room. And it was absolutely amazing. He's playing against professional players, and he gets 2 supers in a minute and just absolutely obliterate everyone. It was a perfect example of flow.
I believe it was actually against IAM, which given they actually went on to win the tournament, No disrespect to God Squad, who are all fantastic players, but obviously pulling off something like that against the team that wins the tournament is, it's incredibly impressive to watch. And yeah, you're not wrong. That's probably one of the best recent examples of flow that we can point to, where you can really see the effect it has on someone's game. This is an actual psychological phenomenon. It's been the subject of a great deal of study. Obviously, it has a lot of interest and importance when it comes to things like occupational therapy, people wanting to be more productive at work, sports therapy, and obviously gaming, of course, is a huge area where flow is really important. So flow, and this really is exactly what you're describing. The way that psychologists talk about flow is they define it as it's a mental state in which a person performing an activity is fully immersed in a feeling of energized focus, full involvement, and enjoyment. In essence, it's where you're completely absorbed in what you're doing. You're not thinking about where you are, how long it's taking. You kind of lose that sense of everything else going on, and you're just doing the thing that you're doing. You're just playing Rift or whatever it is that you're playing with the weapons that you have and the armor. You're just doing that thing. So that is really not only, I guess, kind of maybe the definition that we get from other people, but it's really the definition that goes into a lot of serious research.
Yeah, and anyone who's played sports knows it's the same in a video game. When you're flowing, you're acting and reacting. There is no thinking. You know how people say, don't think, just do? That's the same way it works. And obviously, if you're unprepared and you go into something, you go into Destiny and you're completely not prepared, you may not be thinking, but your actions and reactions aren't going to be great either. So, you can't just turn off your brain and go play. That's not going to help. You have to, like you said, you have to front load your decisions. You have to prepare for this stuff. And when you practice, you will be thinking about things. That's the whole point of practice. You start consciously thinking of them first, so that once you've done them enough, it becomes a habit. It becomes a trait, and then you're not thinking about them at all. You can't just go straight from, this is what I have to do, okay, I'm automatically doing it now. That's not the way it works. You have to practice. You have to master this stuff first. But it's acting and reacting. No thinking, no thought. It's a difficult thing to do. It's a really difficult thing to do. But once you start knowing what you're looking for, knowing that point you're trying to get to, you'll start finding that you're doing and the thoughts are slowly leaving your head. You're seeing someone, and instead of thinking, oh, I should shoot them, you're already shooting them. Because think about that for a second. And the time it takes you to think, I should shoot, the person who's just reacting has already shot. The time it takes that thought to go through your head, those milliseconds that thought is going through your head, have now put you at a disadvantage.
Yep.
And it's going to be that way at first when you try to focus on this stuff. But know that it will not be that way forever. And so don't give up if something is difficult. Don't give up if these ideas that we're giving to you are difficult, because they're supposed to be. That's the point. You're improving.
Yeah, exactly right. And I guess this might be a good time to kind of talk briefly about flow from the opposite end of the perspective, right? We think about flow as players, and that's really where our focus is in this episode, is talking about how to attain that flow state, things you can do in advance, and what it means to be experiencing it. Game designers, Bungie included, think about flow a lot. They want us to experience flow as much as possible. That's really a fundamental aspect of good game design, is that it gives you an opportunity to get into what they think of as like a flow channel, where you're going from one positive experience to the next, where you're always feeling like your skills are sufficient to the challenges that you're meeting. And that's really what it comes down to, right? For game designers, they're trying to present you a challenge that you have the skills to beat. That's why that first, I like to use some PvE examples, because flow happens in PvE too. Flow happens in raids and strikes, story missions. It's actually, I think, a really important aspect of a lot of those things. You have to get into something approximating a flow state to be really successful at a raid or a strike. But it starts at the very beginning. It starts at the first story mission, low challenge, but you also have low skills, right? The first time you played the opening mission of Destiny, you had no idea what you were in for. You were just kind of going along, and they gave you a very simple challenge: one gun, one type of enemy, and then it kind of scaled up slowly from there, right? And that's intentional. That's intended to give you continuous positive feedback. It starts out a little bit hard, it gets easier, and then it gets hard again, and it kind of goes in that sort of a wave. And that's what they think of as keeping us in the flow channel. They don't want it to be too hard that we get frustrated and quit, and they don't want it to be so easy that we get bored and quit. It's a lot more complicated than that, but those are the fundamentals, and that's something to be aware of when you're playing the game. I think for me, it always helps to understand, what the game is trying to tell me, so I'm not intentionally frustrating myself by choosing something that's too hard or too easy.
Yeah, and a lack of flow is actually one of the biggest issues I had with the original story missions and strikes in Destiny. There was seemingly no flow at all. You got to think, in Halo, you would go into a room, there would be a squad of enemies, you would have a flow. You would either pick off the little enemies first, the cannon fodder, and then focus down the big one, or you would take out the main enemy first and then clear out the ads. But there was a flow that went to it, and you always felt like you were connecting points, right? With Destiny, very early vanilla Destiny, it never felt like that. It felt like you would run into a room and then there'd be a wave of seemingly random ads that would just kind of skitter around the floor, and you would wipe the floor with these things that weren't difficult at all to beat. And then there'd be a pause and like this weird lull where you just sit around and you wait for a second, and then a boss would come in, but the boss takes for freaking ever to kill because he's a bullet sponge, so you're not really doing anything. There's no flow. It's just like, it was bad. It was really, really bad in vanilla Destiny, for those of you who remember that. And it was one of the biggest issues that there was with the game. That's why it wasn't enjoyable to play the PvE. Even if there had been a great story, it just would have been a bandage over the fact that the PvE itself, the game design, wasn't fantastic at that point in time. As soon as Taken King came out, it started to get better. House of Wolves was an improvement before that even, but Taken King was where it really started to make sense. Started to flow a little bit. You could tell their map design, their strike design improved. It was a good thing. But flow isn't just for PvP, although what we're talking about is mainly focused on PvP. It helps to have an understanding because sometimes it's a little bit easier to experience the flow in PvE. And PvE on a good map, it's very easy to get a flow going. You know exactly what you're doing. It's very easy to master killing ads and figuring out a boss. So next time, run into a strike and play connect the dots with the enemy space. Like go from one enemy to the next enemy to the next enemy to the next enemy, and try to get them as smoothly and as cleanly as you can, and you'll feel that flow start to pick up. And then you can understand what you're trying to look for in PvP if it's not something that you've ever really experienced enough to be familiar with.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly right. I think it is to a certain extent easier to pick up in PvE, especially when you're playing a well-designed mission, a well-designed raid encounter. So there are in psychology, there's and this is, I think, a fairly recent discussion of it. There were kind of 7 conditions proposed. I really like this list. I think it's a great list that you can apply to your own gameplay in order to try and set yourself up for greater success. So this is 7 conditions to basically open yourself up to be able to attain flow. It doesn't guarantee you're going to get into that flow state every time, but if you're not doing these things, you're actively making it harder or impossible. So the first thing that has to be in place is you have to know what to do. You have to know what specifically the goal is. In a good PvE mission, this is obvious. When you understand a Crucible game mode, this is obvious. But when you don't, the first time you jumped into Rift, you might have been kind of confused, like you had a basic understanding of what the game was, but it was perhaps a little unclear how to successfully play it. The same thing happened. I think this is what you were talking about, Burke. In some of the year 1 story missions, it was just kind of like, I'm not really sure what the goal is here. Like I don't know why I'm doing this. I don't even necessarily know exactly what I'm supposed to do to progress the story in some cases, and that causes flow to swing too far, or the flow to swing too far into anxiety and difficulty, or too far into boredom if it's too easy. So that's number 1. Number 2 is knowing how to do it, right? So you have to know what to do and also how to actually achieve that end. This is a big part of what we're talking about with this Get Good series, is how to actually attain these things. And I guess this is, to be really meta, this is what I'm doing right now by giving you this checklist. So you have to know how to do it. That means the practice that you talked about, Mercules. That means consciously thinking about all of these things that we've discussed in the last 5 or 6 episodes that we've published in this Get Good series. In a raid, that means watching guides. If you're going in for the first time and your team, you're joining a raid group that already more or less knows what to do, you don't want to be the weak link in that case. A blind raid is a completely different thing that I'm not even going to address here. If you're going into a raid at this point in the game, you should know mechanics, right? You should understand how the encounters work. If you're not doing that, you're going to make it much harder for yourself to get into that zone. This is something that I think I played a ton of King's Fall, and at a certain point, a lot of those encounters, you're not even necessarily thinking about what your goal is. You just know, in Golgoroth, okay, I'm number 3, so then you just do your thing. Or whatever your raid strategy is, whatever your equivalent is. If it was Vault of Glass for you, if it was Crota's End, if it was Wrath of the Machine, at a certain point, if you've played that raid enough, you understand the encounters, you're playing with the same people, you know where everyone's going to be, you know where the ads are going to be, and you just do it. You know how to do it. Number 3, following immediately off of that, is knowing how well you're doing, getting instant gratification and feedback on your success. So this is another thing that's easy to get in PvE and PvP, right? If you're getting a lot of kills in a Crucible match, if you're going on a 15 kill streak, then there you go, right? That's your instant gratification. If you are beating encounters on the first try in raid, then there you go. Knowing where to go is obviously a big part of it in PvE, but it also does apply in PvP. You don't want to be feeling lost. If you start to feel lost or confused, that takes you out of flow. It breaks that sequence for you. And then you also have to be doing something that's difficult. If you're playing easy opponents in Crucible, you're not going to get into a state of flow because it's not hard. There's no challenge there, so you can't really get that sense going. And the same thing can happen in PvE. You talked about that, Mercules, story missions, right? If it's too easy, then it's boring. You can't get into a state of flow when you're bored. You also have to be confident in your own skills. You have to feel like you can achieve or you can meet that high degree of challenge. And finally, perhaps most importantly for people like myself who have small children about, you have to have freedom from distractions. There are times when I'm trying to play some Destiny and my daughter's playing in the next room, and she, she's 4. Every 4 minutes she has to come out and talk to me, which is fine, right? I love talking to her, and she's a ton of fun. But if I'm trying to have success while I'm playing Destiny, it's not going to happen at the same time. So usually I just I'll play for a little bit and then I'll give up because I know it's not going to happen. If she wants attention, then she comes first. And so that's why I play at night, right? To get freedom from those distractions. And you have to look at your own life. What are your distractions? How do you escape those so you can set yourself up for success?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the biggest ones is obviously being free from distractions. You mentioned that, and it's the absolute truth. If you can't concentrate, if you can't focus on what you're doing, you can't flow. It's just plain and simple. And another one that I really like that you talked about is confidence in your own abilities. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you don't think you can, you won't. That's just legitimately the way it works. And conversely, if you do think you're going to be able to do it, you probably will be able to do it. That's something that I've always tried to apply, not just to video games, but to my actual life. I always go into something, within reason. I don't buy a lottery ticket truly 100% believing I'm going to win the lottery because, that's not the way that works. But I go into a game thinking I'm going to dominate this game. And that gives me the mental, direction I need to believe that I'm going to. And the thing is, conversely, you can kind of use that against players in trials. You know how you can kind of psych out an opponent, or sometimes you get psyched out. You load into a match, you've got 3 people, in trials. They're all rocking the exact same emblem. Their armor matches, their shaders match, and they're all using meta weapons. And you're like, shit. like these kids are organized, you've kind of just psyched yourself out a little bit right there. And conversely, you may have psyched out your opponent. It's something that is possible to happen. For instance, today, 2 matches in a row, I loaded into a 6-man fire team in Rift. They all had matching emblems and matching armor. And I was like, are you serious? And sure enough, back-to-back mercy rolls. And I may have psyched myself out, but it turned out they were actually pretty good. I was unable to get into a state of flow that entire time. I mean, it just... mentally, I wasn't ready for it. I was being distracted. I was texting. I was talking on the phone. Everything was working against me. And I sat back. I waited about 5 minutes after that game was done. And I was like, all right, if I want to play well, if I want to enjoy myself tonight, let's focus. Let's get rid of the distractions. Let's play. But just how you had your 7 things psychologically that help you, there's also 7 things to focus on in game. You actually have to kind of break it down. There's a couple of sections. There's a couple of sections that I look at specifically that I like to think I've mastered them individually, and we've kind of walked you through them. The first one is your loadout. Are the perks that are on your armor, are the perks that are on your subclass, are they catering to the way you want to play? If you're using a hand cannon, are you using hand cannon loader? If you're using a sniper rifle, are you having extra sniper rifle ammo? Things like that. It's things that make it easier for you to play the way you want to play. Are you using double grenades? Are you using double melees? If so, are you taking advantage of those double melees and double grenades? Are you using Twilight Garrison? It's about the armor. It's about the perks on your subclass. Those things need to benefit you. We told you about that before. Are you getting bonus grenade energy on orbs? Are you getting health recharge on orbs? All these things are little tiny things that if you played without them, you might not notice the difference. But when you play with them, it's just tiny, tiny little advantages that you get. And it all combines to make you a better player, basically. And the same thing goes for weapons. Are you using a meta weapon? Are you using a strong weapon? Are you using good perks on it? All those things, again, combine to make it easier for you to play, make it easier for you to feel good.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. This is, something that I've always thought of, I guess, in my own head as front-loading my decision-making. I try to make all of those decisions before I play the game. And that's really when we talked about, this is one of those things that kind of goes into that. And I really liked, as we were discussing this episode, how you brought up the point that this really does play into flow. Can you really get into that flow state in the game if you've failed to make these decisions in advance? Maybe you can, but maybe it's more difficult because you're not setting yourself up for success in the best way you can.
Oh, it's infinitely more difficult because I have a Smurf account, Hunter, that I let one of my friends start. I let him pick the subclasses, and I go from my Hunter to his Hunter, and it's infinitely harder to get into a flow of things because I'm used to having all my perks this way. I'm used to having all my armor loadouts like this, and I don't have any of that stuff. And I constantly find myself reaching for that second throwing knife, and I don't have it. Or I constantly, find myself, my golden gun cooldown takes too long because I'm running, 5 intellect on my Hunter and only 3 on his. And it makes it harder for me to get into the flow of things. And, you may think the perks don't make that big of a difference, but when you're running with 2 grenades, try not running with 2 grenades and see how often you're reaching for that second grenade and you don't have it. You start to in your head understand when you're going to have a grenade for an engagement or when you're going to have a melee for an engagement. And when you don't have those things, it breaks up your flow. Conversely, if you only have 1 and you move to having 2, it might improve your flow. You might start getting into it a little bit faster, feeling yourself playing a little bit more aggressive because you know that your perks have made your subclass more forgiving. The same thing happens with weapons. At first, when you try out a new weapon, the recoil pattern may feel different. The stickiness may feel different. The rate of fire may feel different to you. It may feel weird. But as you use it, instead of having to think about how do I compensate for this recoil, how far away can I engage someone, how fast do I have to shoot this, how do I have to pace my shots, you start to feel it, and you start to get better at it. And by the time you've used the gun for, 500 kills, 1,000 kills, you're not thinking about the recoil pattern anymore. It just happens. You're not thinking about where the engagement distance are. It just happens. You're not thinking about how you have to pace your shots. What I do when I start using a new gun is I count my shots in my head. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. I'm not counting and then shooting. I'm counting as I shoot, right? And after 100 or so kills with that weapon, I'm not counting in my head anymore. I'm not thinking about counting at least. I'm automatically doing it, and I've got that pace down. I've got that pace down. And now every time I shoot with the Chaos Dogma, it's 1, 2, 3, but I'm not thinking about counting. It just happens. And so my pace is perfect with it. And I do that every time I switch to a new gun. Those two things you can start preparing for before the game. There's also a couple more. The game type. What game type are you going to go into? Are you going to go into Control, Clash, Rift, Rumble, Trials, Skirmish, Salvage? Which game type? They all play differently. That's the whole point of game types. If you go into Control and you play it like Clash, your team's probably going to lose and you're probably going to have a hard time getting into flow. If you go into Salvage and you play it like Skirmish, it may end up being the same thing. That's the way it works. You need to think about your game type, think about how you're going to play that game type, because if you're trying to play Rift the way you play Clash, if you're trying to play Clash the way you play Rift, that's a big issue I was having. I hate Supremacy, and this last week, Supremacy was the only option I had besides Mayhem for 6s. Well, I despise Supremacy. I haven't played it basically since Rise of Iron came out. I was trying to play Supremacy like I was playing Rift, and I was getting obliterated. I had to stop and think, this is Supremacy, this is how it's supposed to be played, I need to play it like it's Supremacy. And I started playing better. You need to think about those things. Game type is very, very important. You don't want to play one game type like another. They're all different for a reason.
That's absolutely right. Yeah, it seems like, and I think this was a running joke for a long time, that a lot of people just play every game like it's Clash, right? They just go for kills. People are used to that team deathmatch mentality. And especially in Control, I know for a long time, even Deej was making jokes about it's not Clash, it's Control. So, I mean, you're absolutely right there, 100%.
Yep. And then the next one, we talked about it 2 weeks ago, but it's the map. You have to understand the map. If you don't understand the map, if you're just running blindly around the map, how are you ever going to get into flow? That goes back to what you said, knowing what to do. If you don't know what the hell is going on a map, you don't know what to do, much less know how to do it.
Yeah.
So you absolutely need to have map control. And, we talked about that entire thing. We've got that whole episode if you want to give it a listen to. I don't feel the need to elaborate on it here because we already did an entire, discussion about it. Your emotional state. This was a few weeks back. I think episode 43, the one we did with Famous Birds from Crucible Radio. We talked about your emotional state. If you're tilted, it is impossible to get into flow when you are tilted.
Yeah.
If you are angry, if you are upset, if you are stressed out, you aren't going to be able to flow. Your emotional state is immensely important to being able to do that. You need to be able to clear your mind, at least be calm, because all those angry thoughts that are going through your mind, I can't believe that guy just teabagged me, I'm going to go get him back. Well, now you're thinking about getting revenge instead of acting and reacting what you need to do.
Something I would throw in there, because this is a huge challenge for a lot of people, right? It's very easy to get on tilt like that. So flow kind of falls, like I said before, in between like the two sensations of like anxiety or like, extreme difficulty, which is, I think, what happens a lot of times when you get on tilt. You start to make stupid mistakes and the game suddenly feels really difficult. But it also, on the other end of that spectrum, is kind of boredom or even relaxation could be looked at as the other end. And sometimes what you need is not to try to get into a flow state. If you're upset, you need to relax, right? You need to kind of move away from that anxiety and try to calm yourself down. And sometimes that means you need to go do something easy. You need to go play Patrol for 20 minutes and calm down. And then maybe you'll have a better chance.
Yep. And if you can't get a handle on your emotions, how do you expect to be able to get a handle on the game?
Yeah.
Your emotions should be the easiest thing for you to control because you're the only one who has any effect on your emotions. You're the one who can tell yourself, okay, stop being pissed off about this. It doesn't matter. That's the way you look at it. You can't control what another player does in the game, but you can certainly control how that other player makes you feel. And so you definitely need to be aware of that. Following that, there's awareness. How's your communication with your teammates? We always talk about how you want to play with teammates if at all possible. How's your communication with your teammates? Are you situationally aware of what's going on? Because if you're not, if you're looking little picture, it's really, really hard to get into that zone because you're going to be only seeing a small portion of what's going on in the game. There's going to be things surprising you constantly if your awareness isn't great. And most of that comes from communicating with teammates. But even if you're not talking to them, we discussed this a long time ago. Look at where your teammates are on the map. It shows you where they are. It shows you when their shields break so you can see when they're in combat. That's a way to gain situational awareness. If the entire other team is wiped, look at where your team is on the map, and you can basically predict with pretty high accuracy where the other team is going to spawn. Conversely, if nobody's in combat right now, but you know that the other team is all back alive, look for the first one of your teammates who goes into combat if it's not you, and run over there to help them. You need that awareness. You need that big picture to be able to get into the zone. And then last, you need to have a strategy set out. If you're just running around haphazardly doing whatever it is that you do and you have no idea what you're doing, that goes back to knowing what to do. If you don't have a strategy picked out, if you don't have a way you want to play, a way that plays to your strengths, a way that plays to the strengths of the game type, the strengths of the map, if you don't have a strategy going on, then what are you doing? You know, if you don't know what to do, then everything else after that becomes basically a moot point, because you're playing without purpose at that point in time. And you can say, well, the purpose is to win. The purpose is to get more kills than my opponent. Okay, that's fantastic, but that's not enough. You can't just say, I want to kill more, because I can guarantee you some of the players on the other team have thought about it more than just saying, I want to kill this person. And if they've thought more than you, you're going to be the person who is constantly getting dropped on by another player. And that's something we want to avoid. So just to summarize those things, Kit had his 7 things. I've got my 7 things that I feel like make up the actual state of flow. Things you had to think about initially. It's your loadout, your weapon, the game type, the map, your emotional state, your awareness, and your strategy. If you can practice all of those things to the point where you're no longer consciously thinking about those things, they're just happening for you. To me, that's a complete state of flow in the Crucible. And it's not easy to achieve. I even have difficulty achieving it. There's been times, I was talking to you before the podcast started, there's been times where I've gone 3 days being out of flow because something happened in my life, or, you know, I'm just not focused. And it's awful. It's absolutely awful, especially at a high level of gameplay.
Yeah, it's definitely frustrating when you know that you're playing below your level. And I think, you know, I mean, again, the thing that I want to reiterate for people, if you get stuck in that state, understanding what flow is and how it works is so important. Understanding, okay, I'm really anxious, I'm really worked up, I need to relax, right? I need to calm down. On the other hand, if you're kind of moving toward boredom or apathy, you need to decide, okay, am I doing something interesting? You know, what can I do? What can I focus on that I am interested in, right? If you hate Supremacy, it's just not fun for you, and you're like bored playing Supremacy, then maybe you need to pick a different game type. Maybe you need to go play Rift, right? So you need to understand how this works so that you can also understand your own psychology and hopefully have a little more fun in life and in Destiny.
Yeah. So I just wanted to say, I posted a couple things on Reddit the other day. I just wanted to get, you know, the idea of flow that I had out there. I wanted to see what people thought about it, and I wanted to hear what everybody else thought about it. We already told you what Lime Punch, King Koala, said. He said it's, you know, the mental state where you don't have to make an active, conscious effort to successfully accomplish what it wants. What you do, you're basically completely absorbed. You've mastered it. It's automatic for you. We had a couple of other people who, you know, said there are things like flowing from one point to another, almost like you're a liquid. You go from one action to the next action to the next action without any conscious thought in between them. You see, it's the same thing. The moral of the story you're going to get here as we read out some more of these is that basically everyone knows what flow is. People describe it in their own different ways. Some people say, you know, going down the path of least resistance mentally, where you're not stopping yourself every time you do something. You're just, you know, hitting action after action after action, reaction after reaction. One guy said he has this weird feeling before he even loads into a game sometimes that he's either going to perform well or terrible. And sometimes he just feels like he's going to perform well and it seems like everything goes right for him. And sometimes he feels like he's going to perform bad. And, you know, it does. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy type thing. Again, we talked about that. You know, the pace of the match. Are you pushing the pace in a way that's favorable to you? Are you being pushed back in a pace that's not favorable to you? Is your flow broken because of that? We talked about before the podcast started how sometimes you'll get on a 15 kill streak and you'll just be flowing and then you die. And then it just breaks. Everything breaks down. We had a couple of commenters say coming back from a respawn is one of the hardest things to do to keep your flow going on. You know, you get a 15 kill spree and then you go 1 for 1 the entire rest of the game. And it kind of really sucks to feel that. Or you get dropped into a game midway through it, and all the flow is going on around you, and you just got dropped into the middle of it, and then it's kind of difficult to pick it up. That's another thing that's very, very common. I know I experience that all the time. One of the commenters even said that sometimes he just stops and waits for a second, and maybe waits for a couple of teammates to appear behind him so that he can run out in a group so he's not running out by himself. Or he takes stock of the situation, he sees what the score is, what zones are captured, who's got the rift, or who's got the spark. He stops, he waits.
Yeah, that really comes back to everything we've been talking about here tonight, is in terms of knowing what to do. Like, you can't in that situation know what you need to do to succeed if you don't take stock of it. That's fantastic.
We had quite a few people who commented on map flow, the actual flow of a map itself. We talked about that 2 weeks ago when we were discussing engagement flow. They said if you don't know the engagement flow of the map, there's basically none of the rest of the stuff matters, which is true. Slick talked about how if your teammates aren't helping you out, that can kind of break the flow of a team-based game. If your teammates are just sitting back and not really being aggressive, or they're not helping you out with team shots, that can really hurt the flow of a game. It can hurt your own personal flow.
That's especially true in PvE as well, especially in raids. One person can bring down a raid team if they're being uncooperative, or if they're being really salty. So it's important, I think, for everyone to try not to be that person. But you want to recognize when you are taking yourself out of that flow state, and or recognize when somebody else is bringing you down. Like you said, Mercules. Other people only affect you as much as you allow them to. You don't have to get salty just because somebody else is being salty. So
you can see that basically if you lose any one of the 7 things, so you've got the 7 psychological things that you talked about, Kit.
Yeah.
You've got those things that mentally are what you have to make sure you have. You have to check off those checklists. And then specific to the game of Destiny, you've got the 7 things I gave you.
Yeah.
And all 14 of those things need to be checked off. If you are missing any one of those 14 things, you're not going to be able to enter a prime state of flow. It's not going to happen. You've got the psychological aspect, and you've got the actual literal aspect in Destiny. And that's what's so fascinating to me, is that that's what makes good players so good. They have all of that, almost all of the time. That's why they're pro players, or that's why they're the best players. It's so amazing to see that they can do that. But it also explains what it is that you need to be doing. What we've told you all the episodes up until this point, where we were telling you how to get good. We were telling you what to do. We were kind of telling you how to do it. But we weren't giving you necessarily the end game. We were just saying, go practice this, go practice this, go practice this. Don't do this. Please do this. Try out this, right? Now what we're giving you is we're giving you the wrap up. We're giving you the end game. Once you've practiced these things enough, you'll stop thinking about practicing them, and they'll just become second nature. You'll just be doing them. Once that happens, you move on to the next part. Or you could practice all of them at once if you want. It's a little bit more difficult that way. Some people just like to focus on one at a time. Some people like to spread themselves out. I think in the end, it takes about as long for each one, realistically. But maybe you focus on one, you move to the next one. Maybe you come to a slight mastery of all of them at the same time. And this is that next step. Flow is that next step. It's when you go from being an improving player to a great player, to a good player. You make the jump, as we like to call it.
Yeah.
And you'll notice that previously you'd be playing players who you would know would beat you. And you're playing good games against them. You're beating them. Players that statistically may be better than you, may have higher ELO than you, higher KDs than you, you're beating them. And the reason is because you're getting into the flow. It's not impossible. Like we said earlier, bad players don't get into flow that much. Good players get into the flow a lot. Improving players get into the flow more often than they used to. So you'll start feeling yourself getting into that flow more and more. You'll start winning more games. That's what happens. All those things we gave you before, you wrap them up, you put a nice little bow on top of them, and that's when you really start to play better.
Yeah. Yeah, you'll absolutely... And it's not always a linear path either. I think that's one other important thing to add here. You're going to have periods of success, and then sometimes you'll have setbacks. And you have to understand that those setbacks are part of the process of growing, right? You're going to come into things, and maybe at first you're playing other people who are new, and it's easy, right? Nobody's good at the game. And then you start to improve, and it starts to get really easy for you, but then you start playing better players, and suddenly it's hard again. And you have to you have to understand, of course, this whole process. It's a climb. You're taking a step from starting out to being a good player, a step from being a good player to being a great player, and we're all at different points on that path. And this, understanding each of these items, understanding how to set yourself up mentally to succeed, understanding and Merc, I almost feel like we need to recap these lists one more time when we wrap this up, just to cover it, because
I absolutely think we do.
Those 7 topics that and we've talked about all of these on the podcast, but that you outlined again in this episode are so important for success in Destiny. It's a complex game. There's a lot going on, and you have a lot to practice, and I have a lot to practice, and so that's so important to understand. It's going to get easier, and then it's going to get harder again, and then it's going to get easier again. It's going to continue like that for a long time, and that's fantastic. That's what makes the game fun to play.
When you look at your KD day by day, it's just going to look like it's going up and down and up and down and up and down. But then when you look at it month by month, you're going to notice a steady trend upwards. Year by year, a steady trend upwards. And you're going to see that even though it's hard to see the differences, hard to see the changes day by day, when you look back at where you started, you will notice the differences. And I fully agree with you. We definitely need to recap those things. So
yep.
I'm going to go over mine one more time. As soon as I finish my 7, you go over yours. So these are the literal ones you need to focus on in Destiny. Your loadout, your weapons, your game type, the map, your emotional state, your awareness, and your strategy. All right. And if you want to listen back to podcasts in the past, or you want to look at some articles, we've got articles out there that cover every single one of those things. Your loadout is going to be your subclass perks and your armor. You always want the perks to be benefiting your playstyle, all right? You don't want useless perks on either your subclass or your armor. Your weapon, you want a good meta weapon with good meta perks, and you want to play with it and understand it. You want to get that pacing down. You want to understand the recoil, the stickiness. You want to understand the optimal engagement distances. You want to feel that weapon. The game type, every game type has its own particular flow. And if you'll notice that every one of these is like their own minor flow. There's like loadout flow, weapon flow, game type flow. The map, there's map flow too. You need to understand the maps. Your emotional flow, how are you feeling emotionally? Is your mind a blank slate? Are you ready to play? Are you ready to learn? Are you ready to better yourself? Are you ready to gain experience? Or are you pissed off? Are you angry? Are you upset? Are you focused? Are you scatterbrained? Are you distracted? Your emotional flow is very, very important. Your awareness. Are you ready to look at the big picture? Are you ready to observe your teammates, communicate with your teammates? Or are you narrow-minded, myopic? And then your strategy. Are you just running out there trying to get kills, or do you know what it is that you want to do? Do you know how to do it? Are you focused on being aggressive? Are you focused on being defensive? Which one? Each one of those things is their own flow, and then combined, you get Destiny's overall flow. And then and then there's the psychological aspect of it too.
Right. And so that, just to recap that again, because it's been a little bit here since I went over that. So the seven kind of psychological flow conditions that have to be in place to enable you to get into it. One, what we've said so many times on this episode, knowing what to do, having clear, specific goals in mind. That means not, I want to get a lot of kills. That means I'm going to control this area of the map by doing these specific things. That's a clear goal. Knowing how to do it. Okay, how do I control this area of the map? What specific things are important to do? Where do I position myself? Where will the enemies be? That's knowing how to do it, right? In PvP and PvE alike, knowing where to go, understanding the map from a top-down perspective so that you know where you are, where your team is, and where the enemies are. Navigation is so important. You don't want to be sitting and thinking about navigation when you need to be playing the game. Getting instant gratification, you need to understand what success means to you in this instance. Sometimes that does mean getting kills. Getting kills is not a goal. It's the gratification. It's the feedback. You're getting kills in PvP. That tells you that you're being successful, right? You're winning matches. That's another piece of feedback, but it's not as instant. So I don't look at wins quite as much. But wins can be, because they come every 10 minutes. That can be another piece of feedback to tell you that you're doing well. Continuing on, number 5, you want to be taking on challenges that are not too easy and not too hard. You don't want to be, running around in a raid necessarily in basic gear when you're completely underleveled and have no idea how the mechanics work. You don't want to bring in somebody who just started the game and try to say, hey, go figure out Vault of Glass. Like, it's not going to happen for them, right? It's going to be really frustrating. On the other hand, you don't want to necessarily be going and just playing Patrol all the time, right? At a certain point, that's boring, right? Because it's too easy. So you need to find challenges that fit your abilities. And at the same time, you need to have confidence in your abilities. That's number 6. You need to feel like you are a skilled player. You need to not just like feel like that, you need to believe it. So it should have some basis in fact, right? And I think a lot of people, if you sit and look at the things that you've accomplished in Destiny, a lot of us, I think, are skilled players, and it's just recognizing that we have developed those skills and then internalizing that belief. And number 7, perhaps for some of us, the most important and most challenging, most elusive condition, freedom from distractions. Have you set yourself up in an environment where you can actually focus on what you're doing? This is important to learning. You can't learn if you're distracted. It's also important once you are done learning and trying to apply the things that you've learned. You can't apply those things that you've learned about Destiny. You can't apply the things Merc talked about. You can't apply the things I've talked about if you are distracted the entire time. So those are the 7 psychological conditions you need to put in place to achieve flow.
All right, and that's your guys' homework for this week. Take a look at all the things we've taught you up until this point and know that this is where you're going with them. Everything you've been practicing, everything you've been working on, everything you've been consciously thinking about, know that now that this is the end game. You want to keep doing it, keep doing it, keep doing it until it's second nature.
And that is it for us. This has been yet another hour of Destiny Massive Breakdowns. This is Kit Kutcha. Peace.